I'm Alyce McKenzie, and welcome to What's a Preacher to Do? A series of brief interviews in which we consult with scholars from various disciplines and ask their wisdom for the tough task of preaching in a time of COVID. Today, we have as our guest Dr. Ted Campbell, Professor of Church History at Perkins School of Theology. And thank you, Ted, for being willing to be with us this afternoon. So
Good to be here.
What is the key insight from your work on this difficult task of preaching in the time of COVID?
Well, it is a difficult time, and I'm a historian, so I tend to take a very, very, very long view of the history of Christian communities and preaching and so forth. Even though my focus is on the history of Wesleyan and Methodist communities, I've taken this longer view. And in that longer view, I would say I see two kinds of preaching happening that correspond to two kind of different sorts of churches. The one is the church that wants to appeal immediately to the contemporary culture, to draw people in, to try to build up a community from perhaps those who haven't been religiously serious in the past. And then the other pattern would be the more historic churches that have stability over hundreds of years. In fact, I would say churches that are more than 600 years old, church communities that are that old, have a long tradition of preaching in a way that builds up the congregation, that builds up the sense of their connectedness to tradition, and that enables them to put down deep enough roots that they extend their ministries through not just decades, but centuries. And the types of preaching you can kind of see are very different. If you're trying to attract that group of contemporary people and reach out to them and their culture, that's one thing. And actually, you could say it has a different skill set than those whose charism, if you want to say, spiritual gift is to build up, to edify the existing congregation. But I'm going to make the case you got to do both. You really have to extend in a new way. And on the other hand, you've got a kind of sacred obligation to build up existing congregations. And I think that takes preaching on doctrine, preaching about practices, explaining what we do in the Christian faith. It's an interesting thing to me. You might have thought from the stereotypes we have about John Wesley that he was entirely on the side of reaching out. I don't see it. I don't see it in his preaching at all. His preaching is doctrinal. It's about practices like the Lord's Supper, fasting, and so forth. And I think he's much more in line with the churches that were building up communities that exist over time than with the more, you might say, the more contemporary model that builds up new communities. Does that make sense?
That's very helpful. Do you think he would have been on board for preaching online?
It's interesting. Yeah, I think he used contemporary media. One scholar has written that George Whitefield was the first media preacher because he used contemporary media like broadsheets. He had people who would announce when he was coming to towns and make sure that enough resources were there to support him and that people knew about it and so forth. So there is a sense in which John Wesley was very connected. He wrote, I'm editing his letters. He wrote tons of letters to people. And that was not a new technology, but if you think about the fact that they had just built a system of toll roads in England and letters could now get out by those toll roads, it was almost like when we started using email or even tweets. There's a couple of letters of John Wesley that read like tweets. The shortest one is, "Jackie, why are you not in Bristol? Are you out of your wits?" That's it. And you can imagine him putting the little frowny face glyph at the end of it, you know?
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. So the takeaway would the takeaway be maybe use media that are at hand, but keep the content solid and
I think that's a good way to put it.
Well, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
Appreciate this very much. And preachers, be on the lookout for the next installment of What's a Preacher to Do?